welcome back. Now that we have had some time to ground ourselves in a word of hope and engage in some learning and reflection, we are so excited to move to the panel portion of today's event to hear from some absolutely incredible speakers and leaders in both the church and in our community. And before we get into the panel, I just want to make one note. At this time, the chat is restricted, so you can only chat with panelists. I know that can, in some ways, minimize our community connections, but we have chosen to do that because it allows us to better manage your questions so that we can make sure that we are catching and answering as many questions as we possibly can. And so to the point of, there was a conversation that happened in the chat in response to a question that was just shared with the panelists about the reality of sometimes being worried about using the wrong words as we're learning and as language evolves. And so you can see some of the wisdom that BT and Michael shared. And I'll also say, we are all human. And so even those of us who may be doing some teaching and speaking still make mistakes. It is very likely that in the midst of our presentation, Tracy and I said a couple of wrong words also. And so it is okay to make mistakes. We always want to acknowledge that we have made a mistake. If someone corrects us, like Michael said in the chat, we want to say, thank you for correcting me. And we want to make a note to embrace those changes in the language that we are using moving forward. Now, all those language ramblings aside, I am going to mute myself so we can start to hear from our wonderful panelists. I am going to allow them to introduce themselves. So panelists, when it is your turn to speak, if you want to share whatever it is you would like folks to know about you as you enter into your time of sharing with us, that would be fabulous. So I'm going to stop talking and turn the mic over to Mitch.
Good morning again, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here with you all this morning. As Anna said, my name is Mitch Hordert. I am, again, one of the co-coordinators along with Anna East for the Reconciling Ministries Network for Western Pennsylvania. I am a member of Sewickley United Methodist Church in Sewickley, Pennsylvania. I am not as many of the folks have been involved today. I'm a laity, I'm not clergy. I am a social worker by trade. And that's where my skill set is. So I'm going to, I have the unique opportunity that I'm going to just talk a little bit about my experiences with the church, kind of my personal journey, and to kind of talk about where I am today, and I'll kind of wrap up with talking about ways that I've seen both positive things that we've, that have been wonderful ways to be more inclusive and more affirming, as well as you'll hear throughout my story a little bit about some of the things you should not do. So I'll start with, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania. I have lived in Western Pennsylvania my entire life, originally from Butler County in the city of Butler. As I believe when I grew up there, I think 13,000 people live there. I think it's under 10,000 at this point. There have, in that context, I grew up in a very conservative community. I read somewhere at one point that the Western Pennsylvania and specifically Beaver and Butler counties have kind of been named as some of the most conservative areas in the country. It was very interesting to read that a couple of years ago. My family was no different. I grew up with a family where my parents were divorced, but my father was very conservative, very often frequently heard language that was very negative about persons who identify as LGBTQIA2S+. that we were going to hell, that we're an abomination. And so that kind of language was kind of what helped, I guess, no other way to put it, but kind of caused me to remain in the closet for a long time because of the fear of rejection that comes with hearing those kinds of words, especially from my father. And so it wasn't until I was a freshman in college that I came out to my dad. And I like to share the story because it's one of those, if there were ever best practices, which I'm not sure that there really are, but if there ever were best practices for coming out, that this story is not one of them. But I was in community college at the time in Butler when I was in a class. It was contemporary social problems was the class, and we were watching Capitalism: A Love Story, which is a Michael Moore documentary about capitalism, and it just really nothing to do with the LGBTQIA2S plus community, but decided that at that point that I really could no longer remain in the closet and could no longer not be authentic to myself. And so I proceeded to go to my car and call my dad, and his phone rang, and it rang, kept ringing. And you can kind of guess where I'm going with this. It went to voicemail, and I decided that to come out to my dad in a voicemail. And again, that is not something you're supposed to do, I don't think. And so I came out to him, went back to class, and then he started calling me frequently in that while I was in class. And as a good student, I decided not to answer my phone in class because I'm watching this documentary, even though I just left the documentary to call him. And eventually, I did talk to my dad a couple of days later, and it was a really difficult, very hard conversation about, excuse me, about he said I was going to hell, that I was, that I was this very terrible person, that I was a hypocrite, that how could I do this to my family? It was very shameful. And so it was through that I didn't talk to him for quite a few years. But have since have a very positive relationship with my dad now, and we've reconciled and really worked through a lot of that. But it took a lot of work to do that. My mom was wonderful about it, about me coming out, and has always been the support. And it's that kind of support and the familiar support that I had that really helped when, after coming out, I was attending a Presbyterian church, and was an elder in the Presbyterian church, and was forced to resign from that because my lifestyle choices was the language that was used. And so was kicked out of the church. And so my relationship with the church, I've often described as an abusive relationship, where I keep trying to go back to this place in this space that really, for a long time, did not want me to participate, did not want me to be included, really wanted to alienate me and exile me and to push me away. And so I stopped attending for quite a while. And it wasn't until really until 2015, 2016, when I became a foster parent to who I would eventually adopt my son and my daughter, that really began to explore my faith again more holistically, and really look at myself and what I believed, and how I could connect to a community of faith that would support and encourage me, which is how I ended up going to the congregation I go to now. But it was through those experiences and that pain and those challenges that kind of brought me back and to recognizing the amazing, unending love of God, and how how things can change in what to me seems like a long time, but really in the broad scheme of time is a drop in the bucket. And so today I am the chairperson for the administrative council for my congregation. I lead worship as a liturgist probably every couple of months, really involved in a lot of the ministries there, really being affirmed and supported myself, my partner, and my children. Because my daughter identifies as transgender and has transitioned from in her journey. And so really, it's amazing how in those experiences that you see how people can really show the love of God, and how there's things that you can see and feel and experience um, that really encourage people who are LGBTQIA2S plus to participate and to be involved in church and to return from being, maybe they have experiences like mine or more horrific, because they're far more horrific experiences that folks have had than I've had. And I, part of my journey, and I didn't talk about earlier about reparative therapy or conversion therapy. People have a lot of those similar experiences and painful experiences, and so people who identify as LGBTQI2S plus don't sometimes want to come back because they've had this abusive relationship and this experience has been really painful. But some practical ways, kind of bringing this to a close on my part and my the panel. And some very practical things that folks can do. One of the very simple things is just featuring LGBTQI2S plus folks in liturgy and and in sermons and being affirming and talking about every pastor or every layperson who gives a sermon always has examples and always has stories that we share in those sermons. And it's you can using stories about the journeys and experiences of LGBTQI2S plus people is really just a very simple way that you can do that. Some of the things I've seen, and one of the things that actually brought me to the congregation I go to now is marketing materials, sharing information, putting rainbows and different symbols in literature, in marketing materials, in mailings and flyers on websites. Statements of affirmation are always hugely helpful, hugely beneficial, because when folks go to look for churches, they look usually on social media, on websites, they look for those things. They ask people, word of mouth, but they want to see things, that show that they are connected and involved in the community. And so that's another simple, way to do that. Another thing is, I've seen some congregations have, signs on their front lawns that say all are welcome and then feature like rainbows on them. So to indicate that they're not just having a sign up that says all are welcome, but there's secretly that asterisk there that says except for, and then lists all the people that are not there, included. But if you can't do any of that, which is a lot, one simple way they talked about earlier was, having conversations, beginning conversations with hello, my name is, and giving your pronouns to the person, to the child of God that is not, who does not identify as transgender, who is not gender fluid or gender diverse. They may not understand or really be interested in what your pronouns are, but to the person who is a member of the LGBTQIA2S plus community, they know that you see them, that you hear them, that you're showing support for them. And that, that is huge. Just by those simple conversation starters, putting them on your name tags, putting your pronouns. A lot of churches give you a name tag that says, hello, my name is, and put your name on it. You could put right underneath your name, your pronouns is another simple way. I actually found out recently that you can actually buy the stickers, on that say, hello, my name is, with the pronouns on them, which I thought was really cool. Also, and this is something, I don't mean it in a way that comes off as abrupt or something that's being disrespectful in any way, but it's not. It's about learning and learning more, and it's not incumbent upon a person that who identifies as LGBTQIA2S plus to be your personal expert on what it means to be a member of that community or to be involved in that community. It's not their role to do that. It's our role as as people, as humans, as fellow humans, to learn, to engage in conversations of what that means to them, but then doing the hard work of reading and learning, and struggling through some of our own baggage and our own challenges, so that we can be more affirming and inclusive. Um, that's not to say that you don't talk to them about their experiences, but that, that we don't hoist upon them the burden of, tell me everything you know, you're the expert. I'm, but that we are going to be the person that, that we can learn, and we're going to, engage in that ourselves and do the hard work and heavy lifting, not having someone else do it for us. Um, so, um, those are just some simple things. And I'm sure, as the other panelists are about to come, who come next, are going to have far more tips and things. So I just want to thank everyone for their time, for attending and participating and listening this morning to me. And once we get to the questions, I would be more than glad to answer any questions anyone has.
Awesome. Thank you, Mitch. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your story with us, and also share some really, really valuable tips and tools that we can utilize in our ministry context. As Mitch said, we will be moving to a time of question and answer, but what we're going to do is we're going to move through to hear from all of our panelists first, and then we will have space for everyone to answer questions at the end. So I am now going to invite Reverend Dr. Kelly Grimes to our virtual stage.
That's me. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. This is Reverend Dr. Kelly Grimes. I have the joy of being one of the associate pastors and the director of hospitality and congregational care at Foundry United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. So let's see. I think I did my homework. Let me think about this. So I am originally from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church in the Baltimore, Washington Conference. I'm trying to think what else I need to share. I am an active ally of our siblings far and wide. And so, so let me just share a little bit about what we share at Foundry. So I loved that the last panelist, I'm sorry, I think that was Mitch, was sharing about some of the things that some of the opportunities we have to be more inclusive. One of the things that I'm just going to skip to my to what I would, so some of my ideas for sharing with you what we do at Foundry. So at Foundry, we are, well, first, let me say this. When Foundry became a reconciling congregation a little bit over 25 years ago, it was a 4-hour meeting that barely passed. And so the first thing I will say to you is that congregations, now you look at Foundry 25 years from now, 25 years later, and you're like, wow, they're out and reconciling congregation and they do it with gusto. But that was not how it started. It was really like, I mean, it really barely passed by like the skinniest of margins. And so Foundry has had to grow from that time. And there were a lot of questions. And there are still times when we get things totally wrong. Okay, so I would first say to you that not to be not to be too shocked, if you probably won't be, if it's not met with a lot of success. If it's by a skinny margin that your congregation decides to be reconciling, don't be surprised by that and those beginnings, because your congregation can grow and can change and can flourish and even if it's by a skinny margin, that they get to make a decision. Okay, so for instance, like at Foundry, we put out we have trans flags, and we have reconciling flags, and we do it up, okay, at Foundry. And it's all beautiful. So don't be surprised if it's, or don't let it hurt your heart too much if things don't go overwhelmingly, because everybody's got to start somewhere. So at Foundry, we are doing a few things to continue to open ourselves up to make sure that we make room for all people. So we're working on the general conference front and on annual conference fronts. We do that part. We're also very sensitive to intersectionality, and so how does the LGBTQIA family, siblings intersect with things like racism and culture and all kinds of things. So that we're not in our attempt to welcome one group, we other another. And so being able to give opportunities for those who are at different intersections in our community, in our world, to have voice, and for those voices to be heard, acknowledged, and received and appreciated, is sometimes tough, and sometimes gives pushback. And we're at Foundry, we're not afraid to have the tough conversations. So and then we give spaces for siblings who need it to be able to share what they need to share in an environment where everyone can understand. So and no one's saying, hey, explain yourself or any of that stuff. Everyone is like, here's your space to do that. So we have classes, we have support groups, we have retreats, we have pool parties, we have all sorts and types of things I'm laughing because it's all fun, to give people room to express themselves. We have places where places like, like the pastors, we give room for those who need the kind of care, particularly if they have been hurt by the church. They've been hurt by family, by friends, in relationship. However, we give room for that. So as pastors, it is, I know that I take it as, I take it very seriously, how I give room for those, especially who've been hurt by the church. And so we make space for that as well. And then we celebrate in our community. So we're super involved in the Pride Parade, something that I have yet to experience with Foundry because of COVID. But we're very involved with other communities. We make sure that we connect with other communities. I mean, there's strength in numbers. So it's really great that you have this going on today, so that you can continue to connect and do things together. Even if you're on opposite sides of the area of Western Pennsylvania, you can still do things together. And so we find ways to connect with other faith communities, and they don't have to be Christian. Other community centers, and ways that which we can listen. That's the first thing we try to do. We try not to go in and tell people. We listen and hear what their needs are first, and ask them what they need. And so I think that that's also a really good thing that Foundry is finding their way to doing, is making sure that we have our ears open so that we can hear, because it's easy to just say, oh, I know what you need. And that's not, that's not helpful. So I would suggest that you hear what the people need in your communities, and then see how you can fulfill that, instead of assuming what they need, instead of assuming their experience, instead of assuming all those things. That you listen, and we make space to do that, make space to listen. And that's all I have to say for now. I'm gonna hush, and thank you so much for having me. If you have any questions, we're so thankful. I'm ready to answer.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Grimes, for sharing a little bit about the Foundry story and some really, really valuable ways that folks can actively engage in inclusive and affirming actions. So one note that I'm going to make, I know that some folks are asking questions in the chat, and it may be confusing for participants since questions are only going to the panelists, and then sometimes we are answering them to attendees without you all seeing the questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the chat up to all panelists and attendees. And so what this means is anything that you post in the chat that says to all panelists and attendees will be seen by everyone. Anything you might want to share privately, simply check only to all panelists, and that will not be seen by all of the participants. So that said, I'm going to turn the virtual stage over to Willie Miller and Joe Spalding, who are going to share a little bit about their journey and some additional tips and tools and things that we can learn from them about being inclusive and affirming.
Thank you for having us. My name is Willie Miller, and this is my husband, Joe Spalding. We live in Indianapolis, Indiana. We both go by he, him pronouns. And for our time today, we're going to tell you a little bit about our story and our relationships to the church. We're both lay people. I work as a librarian at a local university, and Joe is an engineer. And then we'll talk about some practical tips we've learned from our church community that we think could be helpful for others.
Yeah. So a little bit about my story. I grew up in the suburbs of Indianapolis, and I think I have a pretty typical story, but I do want to say my story was also, or I guess I want to say is, everybody's story, everybody's coming out story is unique and different and nuanced, and mine in particular was surrounded by sort of a theme of adoption. I was adopted when I was 3 days old, and my biggest connection, or what drew me to church later in life, I started going to church on my own in high school, went to church a little bit as a kid, but not too much. Was the story of adoption and God's love for his children, and that all of God's children are adopted into his family. And so that really spoke to me, and started going to church as a freshman in high school. But prior to that, when I was in 3rd grade, already knew that I was gay. And ever since, at that same time, I was also told by whether it was at church or by friends or even parents, you hear that that's not right, that is incorrect, that you would go to hell for that. And how traumatizing is that for an 8-year-old to hear while still struggling with their sexuality? It's terrible. But so I starting freshman year, starting to go to church, tried to pray the gay away. That did not work. And came to the realization in college, I think that God wants me to be happy in who I am and work do good work for his kingdom rather than be excluded from the church, and be on the outskirts and not be helpful in bringing his kingdom forward. So I came out to my parents in college, and that was both rough and wonderful all at the same time. And that same year, Willie and I met, and we have been together for 8 years now. Ooh. And it's been a wonderful journey, a crazy rocky journey. I'm keeping my story as short as possible, but what I want to say is that a coming out story for every single person is unique and different and nuanced, and is not everybody is the same. So yeah, it's really important to listen and learn when those stories come up, and I think they're really helpful. Yeah.
So for me, my story is different than Joe's. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, and I grew up in the church. I was there from moment, I guess you could take a baby out in public until now, basically. And growing up in Black Southern churches, I learned very early that being gay was wrong. I also, like Joe, knew from an early age that I was gay. And so I struggled with my conception of myself and sexuality in church for a long time, but not about God. So I always believed that God loved me, and I just assumed that Christians were wrong because Christians are just regular people. So it was difficult for me to find a church home, but my faith in God didn't waver. And I feel really privileged around that because I know so many stories of people that we know are different in that way, that they think that a hurtful thing that a Christian says represents God. And so they turn away from God as a result of things that they hear Christians say. After I moved to Indianapolis, I found the church that we go to, which is St. Luke's United Methodist Church. And I was introduced to the church by a friend who said that it was an open and inclusive church. And I didn't really know what those were or what that meant. And then over the past, I think I've been a member of St. Luke's for about 9 years. Over the past 9 years that I've been in community with the folks at St. Luke's, I've really sort of had my worldview of a Christian community reshaped, living in an environment that is open and inclusive for gay people. So getting to some of our thoughts about practical things that churches can do to be inclusive, the first thing that we have is to defend LGBTQ plus rights. One way that our church does this, and Kelly mentioned this during her time, but they participate in the local Pride Festival. We march in the parade. We have a booth at the Pride Festival. Joe and I both marched every year that the church is marched in the parade. And it's amazing what that public display of support does for folks. It shows the world, it shows the people in the community that there are churches that are loving. So many people come to us while we're in the parade for hugs or for high fives, and they are so emotionally engaged in the idea of a church that wants to connect with them, wants to share that God loves them. And so many churches don't do that. And so that's one way that we find it really useful for our church, that they are active with the gay community in our area.
Yeah. Another thing that our church does is they, in the theme of standing with brothers and sisters and siblings of LGBT plus people, is during general conference and the decision to go with the traditional plan, when all of that happened, it was out a few hours later when the decision came out. Immediately, one of the pastors at our church reached out to us and was willing and ready to have a very difficult and intimate conversation about what this meant and what our thoughts were on it and where we stand and how we felt about it. And so being sensitive to the larger things that are happening in the church as a whole, as well as the small things that are happening in the congregation. We are actively being included in the conversation and sought after in the conversation of what our opinions are and how we're feeling and how we're doing with that. And that's so refreshing and so nice. And so, so just loving it. Feels like a big hug, really.
Yeah. Another thing that we found really transformative is how our church shares stories of LGBTQ plus Christians. And I think that Mitch referred to this as well, of having leaders in the church do the liturgy and things like that. At our church, our pastor, Rob Fuqua, led this this sermon series on the Bible and sexuality, where he talked really exclusively or primarily on homosexuality, LGBTQ plus representation in the Bible, and tried to provide context on what the Bible says and where the heart of Jesus and Christians should be. And that was amazing. As a experience to learn, it became a DVD series. I think it's called Faithful and Inclusive. And as a part of that, he had LGBTQ plus members of the church speak about their experiences. Joe and I spoke about ours. That had families and allies speak about their experiences. And one of the things that we noticed that did, as clips were shared in our church and with other folks, is that it gave a lot of people an opportunity and language to have discussions that they hadn't had before or didn't feel comfortable saying. And as I've seen in the chat, a lot of people are uncomfortable with using the wrong words or saying the wrong things. And I think in that environment, we all became really comfortable with the idea that we might get it wrong, but we were there in the same spirit. And that's one of the things that makes me like our church so much and tell people about it, is that it's a place where not only are gay people accepted, but they're also validated and promoted.
Yeah. The last thing that I want to share is our church does a really good job of, like, in little small ways and little big ways of getting involved. So we talked about Pride, and that's a nice big event that they get involved in. But in a little way, but it's also kind of a big way, is our mission statement is we are an open community of Christians helping to give hope, helping to give and receive hope through Jesus Christ. And then they go a step further of defining what open is. And they go through and list, everything in the spectrum that you can think of, LGBTQ plus. They talk about race and gender identity and everything that you could think of what it means to be open. And so I want to say, I know that Mitch talked about earlier, in literature and all that kind of stuff being open and inclusive in that, but I think it's really important to spell out what that means. It'd be easy to say, hey, we're an open community of Christians, but what does that actually mean? And to be able to hear and see it written out specifically is really important and incredibly affirming to know for sure, so you don't have to guess. Yes, I am included here. And on top of that, we also have an LGBTQ plus ministry that specifically works on workshops and meetings and really gathers people together to continue this conversation, and also that intersectionality conversation as well. So big things, small things, are everything across the spectrum is important, I think.
Yeah, and we'll close. I think every service, every Sunday, someone at church says that we are open for you and you are loved. And we really try to live that out in our church. And those are the ways that we think we feel it the most.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Willie and Joe. Last but certainly not least, I am so excited to welcome Helen Ride to the virtual stage, who is our very own, and correct me if I say this wrong, but regional organizer from RMN National.
That's correct. Thanks, Anais. Really appreciate the invitation to be with you all today. And just has been what a wonderful way to spend a Saturday morning with a group of folks in West Pennsylvania who are really committed to our work of nudging our United Methodist denomination towards something that reflects what we believe the kingdom of God looks like. So let me do a little introduction. My name's Helen Ride. I do use pronouns they, them, theirs. I'm 55 years old and I didn't change my pronouns until about 5 or so years ago. So this discovery of non-binary gender identity, I actually identify as agender and queer, has been a gift to me, because this late in life, and not that it's that late, but relatively speaking, has been and is a has been a revelation. It's kind of helped me make sense of the other part of my life that didn't make sense. So I am an organizer with Reconciling Ministers Network, have worked for RMN since 2012, and I'm also a home missioner in the United Methodist Church, which means I am consecrated to the Order of Deaconess and Home Missioner as a lay person committed to a lifetime of love, justice, and service. And if you want to know more about the Deaconess Home Missioner community, I'd be happy to help with that too. I grew up in the southeast of England. You might be able to tell that my accent is neither from West Pennsylvania nor North Carolina, where I now live. I lived in England until 1998, was born and brought up there. And my experience of church really up until my late teens was predominantly fairly traditional Episcopal Church of England church, smells and bells we used to call it. And I had a experience of coming to know Jesus in a new way when I was about 18 years old, and began a season of my life about 12 to 13 years where I was a member of non-denominational evangelical charismatic churches. And that moment in time coincided with a realization that I had of something that had been brewing really for a very long time. Like many others who tell this story, I knew there was something different about me, really probably from about the ages of 7 or 8. And didn't have language for it necessarily, couldn't understand exactly what it was. But more or less exactly at the same time, I became a Christian and joined these evangelical charismatic church. I realized that I was gay. And as I like to say, that was awfully bad timing, because when I went to the pastor and confessed or told him that I was having attractions to people of the same gender, at the time I identified still as female. I wasn't, my gender identity journey came a little later. Then what I heard was, we love you, but that's not okay. We care about you, but that's not okay. In England, for better or worse, we seem to be a little kind of less virulent in our responses to LGBTQ people. I don't know why that is necessarily, but I didn't receive kind of rejection, but I did receive the clear message that being gay was not okay. And so I went through about 13 or so years of ex-gay therapy, all kinds of ways in which I basically tried to change myself to the straight person I believed at the time God wanted me to be. And as others have already said on this call, no surprise, it didn't work. And so I got to, it was around about the beginning of 1997 or thereabouts, and there was a sort of gradual realization that things weren't going to change, and that this was who I was, and I needed to just get on with my life, basically. So I did what is not a necessary part of the coming out story, but it worked nicely for me, is I actually moved to America. And when I landed in America on January 3rd, 1998, I was determined that I was going to embrace all of who I was and not continue to try and change myself. And that meant that for a very long time, I didn't go to church, because I knew that if I went back to the same kind of church that I'd always gone to, we would end up having the same conversation. which was that it wasn't okay for me to be gay and I needed to change, and I wasn't going to take that journey again. So sometimes I wonder to myself, what would it have looked like if my 18, 19-year-old self, instead of being presented with, no, that's not okay, had been presented with, that's wonderful, you're welcomed, you're affirmed, you're perfect as God created you to be. I cannot conceive in my mind how that period of my life, or how even my whole life might have looked like if that had been the message that I had first received. Eventually, after I moved here, I was living in Massachusetts, eventually found the United Methodist Church, Provincetown United Methodist Church at the tip of Cape Cod. I decided to try and venture to risk going to church again, and checked out the churches in Provincetown, which, if any of you have been to Provincetown, possibly the gayest place on the planet, but and I found the United Methodist Church, and I was thrilled that the United Methodist Church there provided a real warm and inclusive welcome. I was able to be there with my partner, Kate. Kate and I have been together now for 21 years, and I was able to be my whole self and not hold anything back. And it was a period of time of really reconnecting my faith and my sexuality, and being able to relearn my faith in a way that was affirming and not unaffirming of myself. So what I wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself and how I landed in this work, how it was that in 2012, I started working for RMN. The thing that compelled me to the work then and continues to compel me in this work 9 years later, even in the midst of a denomination that has made no steps forward since 2012, and in fact, demonstrably could be said to have taken several steps backwards in terms of inclusion. What compelled me to get involved and keeps me involved in this is that I believe churches, small groups, people of faith, individual people of faith, who are willing to be unabashedly, publicly affirming and celebrating of LGBTQIA, Two-Spirit plus people in all their identities and expressions, are saving lives. And therefore, the more individual small groups, churches, regional groups that we can have in as many places as possible, the more lives can be saved, and the more people who, LGBTQ plus people who have typically expected rejection from the church, might have the possibility to not receive rejection, but to receive affirmation. That's why I started, and that's why I'm still here. And so one of the things I wanted to offer today, as you're gathering here as reconciling folks in West Pennsylvania, is just the recognition that as a denomination, we continue to be in an ungodly mess. We are, as some are describing it, in polity hell, which means the rules and the way we make our rules and change our rules in the context of COVID, in the context of a global pandemic where we can't all meet together as a global body, has got us mired in this kind of state of lack of movement, lack of change, and really not being clear about what's ahead. So if we look in the direction of the denomination for some clarity, we will see none. But I want to encourage you to look in the direction of what I believe has already been articulated clearly by the other panelists this morning. If we look in the direction of what we as individuals can do in our places, in our locations, in our groups, in our churches, then there is clarity, because the clarity is we can make a difference. I loved the sermon from Kelly this morning about Jeremiah. I've been thinking about that a lot. Jeremiah bought a field. He prophetically bought a field when all the signs were that that was probably a foolish investment to make. Well, I want to encourage us that we have agency, not necessarily to buy a field, but to nevertheless take action and make a difference and do work. And I think this morning's gathering here right now is an example of that work, of work where we know the value of it, the meaning of it, the purpose of it is good now and will be good into the future. It's going to make a difference now and will make a difference into the future, no matter what or where our denomination lands. So when I am feeling sort of borne down or weighed down by the denominational mess, what I do is I remind myself, okay, that's an area where I have little or no agency. You know, I can do my part. I'm actually a delegate to General Conference and I am doing my part. I'm engaged in all kinds of conversations and things like that. I'm doing what I can there. But what I do over and over again is point myself in the direction of where can I be amongst and around people who are doing the work of saving lives right now. So at RMN, what that has meant for us is a commitment at Reconciling Ministries Network to a new campaign called Rooted and Rising. And the Rooted and Rising, one of the Rooted and Rising goals is to increase and expand the number of places and people and groups and churches that are offering a fully intersectionally inclusive and celebratory welcome to all people. We ground our work of LGBTQ justice through an intersectional perspective, meaning that we cannot do LGBTQ justice if we are not also addressing racial justice, immigration justice, education, economic justice, disability justice, that LGBTQ people exist in all of these ways. I am a white, queer, agender, middle class, larger bodied individual in the United States of America. I experience privilege and I experience oppression. And at RMN, our commitment is to seeing all the identities that people have in the world through the lens of LGBTQ justice. So our work at Rooted and Rising at RMN at the moment is how can we work together across all annual conferences and globally. I was actually on a Zoom call yesterday with some folks in Africa. How can we work globally and in the United States to increase the number of individuals, the number of small groups, the number of churches, the number of regional groups and campus ministries that are saying publicly and without hesitation, this is the kind of group we are. This is the kind of Christian I am. This is the kind of community I'm seeking to build. So that's the invitation I want to offer to folks that are on the call today, and obviously happy to answer questions. West Pennsylvania has a Rooted and Rising team. Many of the folks that are on this call have been part of it and are an integral part of it. We always need more people engaged. It's for those who have a vision for buying a field. And in our day right now, I believe buying a field is investing time and energy in finding the individuals, the small groups, the churches that are ready to take this stand publicly, even in the midst of what I know is a relatively hostile environment. You're not the only conference that is a relatively hostile environment in many ways. And there are groups of people doing this work faithfully, like you are doing it in those places too. And I'm here to encourage you, hopefully to walk alongside you, to provide ideas and feedback and support and all those other things. You know, we're staking a claim. We're building the future church that we imagine and desire and want. And that's our work to do. We can't fix the denomination, but we can set our hearts and our minds and our efforts towards creating the kinds of communities that we hope our denomination will grow to become. So that's my offering this morning. Really grateful again to be with you and happy to answer any questions you might have. This has just been a fantastic way to spend a Saturday morning. So thanks, friends.
Awesome. Thank you, Helen. And I see BT did put in the chat just some more information if folks are interested in connecting. We're happy to help connect you, any of us on the core team here in Western PA, to the Rooted and Rising work. Or you can also go directly to RMN's website to get some more information on that. So I I'm just overwhelmed with gratitude for each of our panelists, for the ways that you shared with us your stories and your wisdom, and just some practical ways that we can be affirming and inclusive at a personal level, a communal level, and also at a systemic level. That this is not just, there's not just one way of engaging in this affirmation work. And so we just thank you for sharing that with us. What we're going to do now is we do have some time for questions and answers of our panelists. I know some questions have already been put in the chat. We also received a number of questions from folks as you registered. And so I will just name the reality that we will not be able to get through all of the questions today. So if at the end of this event you still have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're certainly happy to have further conversation. But what we're going to do now is we're going to move to a time of question and answer. Panelists, if there are any questions specifically that you hear asked that you would like to respond to in some way, please feel free to do so. Panelists and attendees, I'll just ask that you bear with us in that this part can be a little challenging when we're all on Zoom, that sometimes if two people start talking at once, one will have to pause, but we'll all be gracious and make sure everyone's voices are heard as we respond to questions. Mitch, I know that early on, there was a question that you said you were going to respond to. Do you want to kick us off with that?
Sure. So someone sent over a question. They were indicating that they had two friends that were a married gay couple, and they're otherwise quite progressive, but this couple has made comments about people who are transgender, and the statements are very negative, very derogatory. So this person had commented that they don't really understand how they can do that, and it seems strange that this person would correct them. And then they asked, has anyone else run into that? Would they ignore it? Any suggestions? So I'll start off by saying that, unfortunately, there are folks, even within the LGBTQIA2S+ community, who make comments that are not affirming and inclusive of people within the community. It's unfortunate, but it does happen. I have always operated under the belief that you call it out all the time, every time, that you don't ignore it. There's a way to do that graciously, but I think that, we have to, if someone makes a comment that's not affirming, that's not inclusive, that we have to say that's not appropriate, that language, those comments are not helpful. I've had to do this myself, being the father of a child who identifies as transgender. I've had to correct folks who have made very negative comments, people, especially within several friends of mine who have made comments, and even my ex-partner who's hoping to raise my child had made comments that were very negative about my child. And so you definitely have to, say, that's not okay, that's not appropriate, provide, maybe some information, and then hopefully that they'll not keep continuing to do that. But I think we all have to make an effort to create spaces where we're not going to tolerate that kind of language from anybody, whether that's even friends or people in the community. And I will end just by saying that friends hold other friends accountable, and we have to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you. And one of the questions that I also saw in the chat that I'll just open up to any panelists who may have some thoughts on this, it's very relevant to our context here in Western PA, is that there can be a challenge, particularly in our smaller congregations, that the only voice of information is the congregation's pastor. And so there was a question, and I apologize if I paraphrase this, slightly incorrectly, but the general premise of the question was, how do we make sure we are hearing alternative narratives, and how do we make sure our members within our congregations are receiving all of the information available to them, rather than the information just through one voice, which is likely a biased one, as we all have our own biases.
I'd love to speak to that. Hi. So first of all, pastors can't do it all. We cannot. And and I am so thankful for the laity at Foundry. They bring expertise, they bring story, they bring communities that have been othered into the center. They are just wonderful. We could not do what we do at Foundry without them. And so, so I would say that just like this panel is has so many different persons who have bring so many different experiences that help us to learn more, right? How can you in your community find those people who have most likely been othered, most likely been pushed to the side, and how can you help them to have voice, bring them to the center? And so, for instance, with trans rights, we've learned so much. I mean, about just the violence they've experienced, and the, you know, you especially in the community that Foundry's in, where it's you know, upper middle class, you know, they think nobody has any problems. Well, yeah, they do. And how do you bring in the people who can talk more about that? So we had folks to come in and talk to us about trans rights, particularly as we learned more about who was in danger in our community. And so if you just like do the research on who's in danger in your community and then say, okay, these are the people who we need to bring to the center. These are the folks who we need to ask what's going on and help us to learn. And so a lot of that is our laity, who have who talk to the unhoused neighbors who live around the corner, who can say, well, this is what's going on in the community, and then bring those folks in. So so that would be my suggestion, that you really think about the folks who are not in your pews, right? Think about the people who are not sitting there, and then find out where they are and go talk to them, and even more so, go listen to them and say, what's happening? Tell us what's happening, and believe them, believe them, and then bring them in so that they can give, so that they can bring voice to what's happening, right?
That's great. Thank you for offering that wisdom. And I think somewhat actually connected to this is our next question. And so some of this is answered just by hearing what's going on in our communities, but I'll open this up to everybody also. What are suggestions for ways to facilitate healthy dialogue in congregations where members hold a variety of positions on the spectrum, from non-affirming to fully inclusive? Could we talk about how to be welcoming and inclusive even when we are a house divided?
Can I answer that? I'm not a panelist, but I'd be happy to take a shot.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think, Helen, did you have a thought on that also? Because you could certainly add to that after Michael. Anybody, we can have multiple voices answering questions. So we'll start with Michael, and then Helen, you can add some wisdom to that also.
So I'm really blessed to serve a small, very moderate church. And when I arrived, you know, I was kind of filled in that there were some folks who were maybe a little more homophobic, more conservative, that maybe I should be cautious about how I say things and how I present it, and to introduce things slowly. And one of those folks, her grandson married his husband during that time. And I really wondered how the church would approach this and things like that. And it was really a difficult time, because I was doing counseling for a couple that a heterosexual couple that I really didn't think should be getting married, that, you know, had some major foundational issues. And at the same time, this wonderful queer couple was getting married, and I couldn't be a pastor to them. I couldn't offer my services. And it was just a really hard time in my ministry. And I was at the church one day, and I went into the kitchen and I opened up the fridge, and there were about 5 cookie tins in there. And they all said, for Ben's party. And I kind of, tilted my head a little bit. And well, over the week, the whole fridge filled up for the cookie table for this young man's wedding. He was part of the church, and everyone in the church loved him. And I think what I realized is that folks in the church were having a hard time acknowledging their love. They were having a hard time naming that. They didn't want to hurt people who held one idea, one theological understanding. And I don't think they understood that they were causing harm, how much harm they were causing on the other side. I think we often kind of tiptoe on eggshells for people who don't really feel as strongly as we think they do. This woman, I was told, was going to be, one of those stalwarts, and there she is every Christmas with her grandson, with her grandsons, and her great granddaughter. And I think that we need to encourage folks in churches to challenge the assumption that the default or the norm is kind of an anti-gay feeling, and to understand that I've been a pastor for 12 years now, and I've never done a funeral that didn't have a gay cousin or a gay grandson or a lesbian relative in the family. We don't have so many people who hold these strongly homophobic views, but instead we need to encourage and allow folks to be inquisitive, to question, to wonder, and to embrace the folks that they love as part of embracing their faith.
Thank you. And Helen.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I love that. And I think that's definitely borne out in so many cases, is the unexpected places where family members and people turn up differently than you might necessarily expect them to. And it's also true that in some places, unholy hell can break out when these conversations happen, sadly. I wish that wasn't true, but it is. So there are a bunch of resources that within the church, there's a dialogue model kind of thing called Courageous Conversations. Just Peace UMC has a bunch of resources on their website for engaging in these kinds of conversations. Not necessarily specifically about LGBTQ inclusion, but just about conversations across divides of opinion, right? I would also recommend that people, oftentimes what can happen is when a group of allies want to have a group or have a conversation in a church, it can be perceived as being divisive, like, why do you want to have that conversation? It's going to cause trouble. And I really always encourage folks to approach this as that we're seeking to bring an offering of love, a place of safety and conversation to folks who don't have that right now. And rather than sort of coming at it from a point of view of we're going to go over here and have this conversation with the people who agree with us, but see it from the point of view of we're going to lean in to engaging in conversations within the community. Clearly, trying to stay embedded in the community and not away from it. You can't guarantee it's always going to go pretty, because it doesn't always go pretty, is the truth of the matter. But I think if we always have a sort of open, undefended approach to it, that we're not trying to defend territory, we're trying to openly invite people into conversation and dialogue. I think how we engage in it, how we approach it, can make a huge amount of difference. Again, none of this guarantees happy outcomes. There will be people who will get upset. And even those folks, we need to sort of try and help maintain a sort of positive and invitational approach to, because you never know when somebody's going to change their mind, because sometimes they do.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So our next question that I have is, how can churches proactively build relationships with the LGBTQ community instead of waiting to welcome people when they arrive at church?
So we can take a shot at this. We talked about it a bit in our discussion, actively going out into the LGBTQ plus community or communities in your area. So for our area, the Pride Fest is a pretty big deal, and organizations connected to that are partners of our church. So we partner with this one group called Outreach that their mission is to provide homes and safety for teens, especially those who are gay or a part of the LGBTQ plus community. They provide homes, they make sure that they have educational resources, they help them graduate high school and go to college, and we provide assistance, financial support, and opportunities for engagement with them. And so that's one way that we've gone outside of the doors, because our church is in a suburban, mostly white area of Indianapolis, and we understand that we have to go outside of the church's doors to bring representation to folks who aren't there.
Absolutely, thank you. And to the note of the previous question, Carly also put just some thoughts in the chat for everyone about the importance of making sure we are in fact showing support for LGBTQ members in our congregations when we are in a divided space. So the next question that I have is, when you are working to make the church a safe space for LGBTQ folks, what do you think is one of the most important things for the church to do? And I know many of you have shared some practical tips and tools in the midst of your reflections and your wisdom, but I think the way that I see this question in some ways is about prioritizing as far as where do we start, and when we're looking at what might be or what might feel like an insurmountable journey, what kind of things can we focus on initially?
Well, it's Pastor Kelly again. So a couple of things. One, staffing. We're intentional about our staffing and that it is representative of the community and everyone in the community. And so it's not just, and so it's a diverse group of people. Two, we have it written down in our policies and procedures, and we make sure that the congregation knows where we stand, and there's no confusion about where we stand. And we say it a lot, and we say it loud, and we wear it on our shirts, and we decorate our church with it. And so you are not going to come to Foundry and wonder, are they a reconciling congregation? I wonder. You're going to see it everywhere, and we'll tell you. And so even from we have a board that has our SPRC and all that stuff rolled in. So from the board all the way down to where our babies stay, when we were in the building, where our babies are in the nursery, there's no question what we believe, and that, and that love is love for us, and all means all for us. And so that's the first thing. So my niece identifies as bisexual, and she drove up to my church and she called me from outside and she was like, "Yay, auntie." So she didn't have to, okay. So, so let's just say we don't hide it. And so that I think is very important, but also for those who are our lay leaders, we are constantly teaching, training, and giving them the words so that they can teach and train. All right. So, so I would just say those are a couple of things that we do at Foundry.
Great, thank you. Next question is, in the spirit of intersectionality, in an all-white area and congregation, how do we become inclusive? maybe we don't have time to get through the whole question today, but if anyone can share some thoughts about that, that would be great.
It looks like Kelly wants to say something, but I don't know.
I'll say something short, is that like our church is embracing the idea of making white people uncomfortable. And so we do things that that have made some of the white members of our church uncomfortable. Like, and this was about 10 years ago, we started a contemporary service where we hadn't had one before. And the purpose of that service was to bring in people that didn't look like the folks who were attending the church at the time. And that has been controversial, I guess, over the years a little bit, but it's something that we're leaning into. And it's something our pastor is really good at, like helping the church understand that like, this is a thing that's happening on purpose for reasons that we care about.
I just about love that, deliberately making white people uncomfortable. I feel like that's a really good way of looking at it, because I think if you are making white people uncomfortable, you're probably doing something right. At least let me just say my areas of growth have been when I've been made to feel uncomfortable because it's made me look at something that I needed to look at. So I love that.
Awesome. Thank you. And I think if there are, if there are folks, oh yeah, go ahead, Ellen.
Yeah, I was gonna say, in terms of, I think that as a broad thing, I think in terms of, I would encourage individuals within the congregation to be engaging in purposeful outreach of support, not looking for help. So you have to be very, careful as white people how we engage in relationship building in communities of color, that we're not going, that's something to be handled tenderly and with care, that we're not going and becoming a burden. But I do think intentional relationship building, and not just with, not within the church realm, but just within the community realm, what are some organizing groups within your community that you can start building relationships with folks? If there are Black churches in your community, other racial ethnic churches in the community, what are some ways you can reach out? If you see they are asking for something specific, help or support, be there, be the support. Don't make this transactional. You're not asking for anything in return. You're just going to be in relationship, walking alongside, getting to know each other. And I think that is, work that is good. In other words, we mustn't approach it from, we need to get people who don't look like us in our churches. I don't think that's the point. The point is, how can we be in authentic relationship and supporting communities that are already out there doing organizing, like what can we do to do that? That would be my sense. But Kelly, if I have that wrong, I'm fully welcome correction.
Well, that was good, Helen. I like that. So I just have to say this. So the United Methodist Church has a very sordid history with race relations, as we all know. And so Foundry is no different. There are two historically African-American congregations that came out of Foundry because of the beliefs of the members of the time at Foundry. And we've got some really nasty racial history at Foundry. And so a lot of this, I would ask white congregations to look at the history of their church and see where they have hurt people, see where the other congregations have come out of your church because it was racist, and how that stuff is permeated in your church. Look at the bylaws of your congregation, especially if they were written at a certain time, and see where just really authentic relationship building needs to happen, because there's congregations. I mean, there are people who believe that stuff was a long time ago and, oh, we get along great. And that's what you think. There are grandmas at these churches whose mothers told them about your church and never to darken the doorstep of your congregation for these reasons. There are churches here in DC that are the same way. And unless those congregations unless those white congregations are actively attempting to build relationship and start something new, call out what has happened. I'm so thankful. I think it was like my first week there at Foundry. Pastor Ginger was like, listen, let me tell you about what we did. And that is why there's an Asbury United Methodist Church, and that is why there's a John Wesley AME Zion congregation, because of our foolishness. And we've got to, and how that's why intersection, paying attention to what's going on at the intersection is so important, because until we get rid of all of these isms, right? How can we say, okay, we're just going to cut out this one ism? It's like, well, we kind of want the whole thing to be healthy, not just that. So, so Foundry is on a journey to racial justice, and a lot of what we're finding is a lot of that ism is connected to homophobia and all kinds of, so we're trying to get all the cancer out, right? And the journey is hard for some of our congregation, some of our members. It's hard, and not just hard for the white folks. It's hard for everybody. And so I would say start with looking around your congregation. If there's a Black United Methodist Church near your white United Methodist Church, there's a reason for that. Ask yourself what that is. If there is a Hispanic church, if there's a congregation of a different heritage real close to your white congregation, ask yourself why that is, and be willing to, to look at how you can build new relationship and grow from there. But you won't know unless you ask. So, thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that wisdom. And I would also challenge all of us in Western PA who may be tempted to say, well, things are all white, or we don't have any people of color in our communities, to look a little bit harder and see what you have in fact missed. So with that, we are just about out of time. And so I just, again, want to thank our panelists for giving us so much of your time and energy and wisdom to help us think through some of these practical applications for becoming more affirming in our churches and in our communities. So I'm going to close us with just a prayer from Peter Morales. But before I do that, I just want to thank you all for joining us, for spending your morning with us on a Saturday, and to let you know we are going to leave the chat open for about 15 minutes. So if you have follow-up questions or want to have some conversation, you're welcome to do that. As you're seeing in the chat also, there are many ways that you can connect with us as the Western PA Reconciling Ministries team. And so we would certainly love to connect with you after this event as well, to continue some of these conversations and get you connected with our work. So with that, let us pray. O Spirit of life and love that lives within us and among us, be with us now. Help us take our history into our hearts as well as our minds. Open us so that we can feel your past live in us, the joy, the disappointment, the passion, the pain, the hope. Let the past, all of it, live in the core of our being. Let us be humble. Let us be honest. Help us to take instruction from our past, and let us also be inspired. But more than anything, let us feel your spirit, the spirit of deep compassion, here among us this very moment. O Spirit of love and life, help us to know, truly know, that we are your people, bound together by our collective memory and, more importantly, by our shared aspirations. We are not perfect. We mess up. Sometimes we talk too much. Yet we are drawn together by what we love, by what we hold sacred, and by a vision of what we may yet create together. Finally, tender and gentle Spirit, guide us, inspire us, embolden us, For our work, your work, O Spirit, is not yet done. We pray all of this in the name of God the Creator and Jesus the Christ and the Spirit through whom we are all connected. Amen and amen.